We've talked a lot about climate change, and I've portrayed it as an opportunity, but one of the people that keeps me grounded and helps with my understanding of climate change has been Dr. Ivan Fernandez. Tom Saviello used to claim he was a soils professor and taught everybody in Maine went through his soils class. But I think, Ivan, when I was there, you were a teacher's assistant, so I never had Tom, although he always claimed I was a protege of his. But I think, if anything, you can claim I'm a protege of yours. If that's good or bad, I'm not sure. But Ivan has been, he is the professor in the School of Forest Resources, Climate Change Institute, School of Food and Agriculture at the University of Maine. He's a member of the Governor's Climate Task Force, and he's been extremely helpful in helping us all understand the principles of the forest and its role in climate change. So, Ivan, thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Great. Thanks. Well, I realize I stand between you and lunch, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk to you about Pat's homework for me was, I think, to give you an update on the work of the Carbon Task Force, and that's what I will do in the next 25, 30 minutes or so. I'm from the University of Maine. I'm a soil scientist, biogeochemist. I did share an office as a graduate student with Tom Saviello, so that probably puts me in one category or another, and certainly still a dear friend. It's polyfluoroalkyl substances, Pat, so now you know. So now my professorial duties are done. The last one, substances, yeah. So anyway, great to be here. A few faces that I know, and I've been around at the university for a long time. It's nice to be talking about the task force. I realize now that I should do this every time and just have the governor come and do the prior talk so I can give you context. I'll work that into her schedule. So there has been a task force, as you know, and I'm going to very quickly give you some of the highlights. The origin of the task force comes, of course, from the Maine Won't Wait plan that you just heard about. The Maine Forest, the Maine Climate Council was originated by Governor Mills to establish a climate action plan. Maine Won't Wait was released presented in December of this past year, 2020, and it's Maine's first integrated adaptation and mitigation plan, and that sounds like just words that go in front of the important part, but the important part to me is that it's the first integrated adaptation mitigation plan. In 2004, the state of Maine had a mitigation plan, which I'll briefly touch on, but not a plan focused on adaptation. And so this is the first integrated, comprehensive plan, as it should be, at a time when, of course, it's so urgently needed. The reason we have a carbon task force is because we're very interested in how forests contribute to carbon cycling. And we are concerned with that because of greenhouse gas emissions. And so the plot here, probably all of you have seen it in one stylized version or another, is Maine's gross greenhouse gas emissions since 1990. And these are reported biennially by the Department of Environmental Protection. And what you see is that in the mid-2000s, I'm not sure the cursor on this works, no. What you see is in the mid-2000s we reached a peak, and since then we have declined. In the recent years we've gone up but then gone back down. We're not on a nosedive by any means unless we do something to change that trajectory. The 2004 plan had as a target for us to be 10% below 1990 levels, and that's why there's a 10% dot on that graphic, which we exceeded. We met that goal. The 2004 plan then just hand-waved about doing things that prevented further damage from greenhouse gas emissions, which we did not have a plan for. And of course, we see those damages around the world, around the nation, and here in Maine unfolding all the time. Thus, the importance of the task at hand. The new Climate Action Plan sets out targets of 45% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 80% gross greenhouse gas emission levels below 1990 levels by 2050. In addition, Governor Mills signed an executive order to, as she noted earlier, have a target of being carbon neutral as a state by 2045. And so it's these ambitious but critical goals that drive our escalating interest, and it's only just begun. We're going to see more and more intensity of focus on policy and economics around carbon as we go forward because of the critical nature of bending this curve. The specific origin of the task force came from Strategy E in Maine Won't Wait, which stated that in 2021, which of course we're in, this stakeholder process was to be established. And as the governor noted, in January she signed the executive order creating a task force on the creation of a forest carbon program for the state of Maine. The task force met for the first time on February 12th. I'm not sure who else, but certainly Pat has been a critical member of that and contributing to reasoned and balanced dialogue throughout. We've met 10 times. There's a draft report that has been out for review. It was due back last Friday, essentially. And those comments are now going to be incorporated into what will be the final draft force report due in November. I have not been privy to the input, so what I'm reporting on here today is the contents of the draft task force report that was, or that is in circulation. The Maine Forest Carbon Task Force has two co-chairs. They were standing on the side of the room there a few minutes ago. Commissioner Beal and Tom Abello out of the governor's office. And then there's 13 other members that range from NGOs, the forest products industry, the university, private sector represented on the list there. I realize you can't read that list from the back of the room or probably from the middle of the room, but I think you would recognize a number of the names on it. So I'm going to walk through very quickly. I was trying to do something more synthetic as I put together the slides, but it's just simply more straightforward and logical for you to get a sense of what's in this task force, the task force recommendations, to do them one by one. And so the actual executive order says the task force on Maine Forest Carbon Program for small landowners, I think many of us would call them small and medium, is hereby established. The purpose of the task force is to develop a voluntary incentive-based program for woodland owners of 10 to 10,000 acres, and so it's that cohort that is specifically targeted, and forest practitioners, to increase carbon storage in Maine's forests. Okay? Then there's 9 specific tasks, A through I. I'm going to walk through them pretty briskly to give you a sense of what the task force is recommending in each. First one's pretty straightforward. Review the available data, very logical and appropriate way to support the deliberations of the task force. We've got information from the university, from NGOs, from a number of different places to look at different carbon programs, and then we had specific information on a number of programs. I think some of you would recognize the names for some of these, the American Forest Foundation and TNC's Family Forest Carbon Program, or Sylvia Terra, the Maine Forest Carbon for Commercial Landowners project, Nova Scotia's Forest Sustainability Regulations, and others. And the task force was specifically looking at what were the goals, what was the structure of the program in order to achieve those goals, and also details about what were the specific forest management practices that were being recommended to enhance carbon in forest lands. The second task was to review harvest levels and carbon stocking data on this cohort of woodland owners. A very appropriate task, and to understand as best we could quantitatively what cohort of the Maine's forested landscape are we focusing on as a task force. As backdrop, that this room knows very well, we're the most heavily forested state in the nation. 89% of the land is in forest, 17.6 million acres. And most of that is privately owned. Most of that is working timberland. And so the question was, first in our discussions, what component of that landscape falls in this 10 to 10,000 acre category to which these recommendations are being developed? This is the only ugly table I'm going to show you, and you probably can't see that from the first row of tables, but there's only a few pieces of this that are sort of the important take-home, and I'm going to tell you what those are. So the 10 to 10,000 acre forest land ownership represents what portion of that overall landscape. In this table, there's a few pieces of data that get at the answer to that question. One of the things that we learned in the process of these deliberations was how challenging it is to try to come up with an estimate of what actually falls within these categories, and so we spent significant time in discussion and in calculations, et cetera. On the right-hand side there, though, in the red circles, the different pieces of data that I'm going to highlight are primarily from the U.S. Forest Service's Forest Inventory and Analysis database. And by and large, the mean or central tendency ended up to be a number in the 40s, 40%. So 43% of the total acres owned fall within this cohort. That represented 46% of the carbon stock, 42% of the total harvest, 44% of the long-term wood product storage, green tons. The 40-some% is the central tendency. The numbers to the right in the brackets go from in the 20s to the 60s in most cases, because that was the range of uncertainty in deciding these numbers. And so there's a fair amount of uncertainty in the cohort that is being targeted based on the data that are available. One of the other charges was to determine the stocking. I didn't use the ugly table. I just made a pie graph of the data, and about half of these lands are considered or classified as well stocked, 52%. 32% are moderately stocked, 7% are poorly stocked, and then 9% are overstocked. And so half of the lands are sort of in a condition that many would consider the target or the goal or the ideal. We did a few back-of-the-envelope calculations as a task force to get some perspective and insights on what's the potential in this land ownership. And so for this one, we took the stocking and we said, what if we developed a program where all the moderately stocked and poorly stocked lands were increased to well-stocked? And if we did that, it would require 1.5 million acres moving from the poorly and moderately stocked to the well-stocked category. It would represent an increased standing stock on the landscape for this cohort of 57 million metric tons CO2 equivalent. I'm going to use those units, million metric tons CO2 equivalent, throughout. Those are carbon dioxide equivalents, so it's taking trees and weight and biomass and turning it into something that we can equate one for one with the way we calculate greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's about a 20% gain in carbon stock. And just to continue the exercise, we said, okay, this doesn't happen overnight. So let's say it takes 30 years to move those lands into the moderately stocked category. What would that mean on an annual basis as far as a carbon contribution, carbon offset, not a legal offset, a spreadsheet calculated offset, compared to greenhouse gas emissions? It's about 1.9 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year, which is about 10% of the current Maine greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, those will hopefully change over time. So if that change took place, there is potential to increase in a significant way the standing stock of carbon that is then offsetting greenhouse gas emissions in the near term. Task C was identify a suite of management-friendly forest practices that would improve carbon stock. We talked at length about these. There were a number of them presented and are included in the documentation. The task force aggregated these down to 5. The first one being avoided forest conversion. We lose about 10,000 acres a year in Maine to conversion of farms and forests. And so first off, we don't want to lose forest land because most of that carbon goes up, contribute to the atmosphere. And then we aggregated into 3 categories of management, the wider number of practices that were discussed. So the first of those 3 categories, number 2 here, is enhance forest resiliency by controlling, managing competition and regeneration, being cautious with disturbance, climate resilience, adaptive silviculture kinds of activities. The second of those categories, conduct intermediate treatments, which is strongly commercial and pre-commercial thinning and managing stocking. And then the third of those categories was practice sustainable harvesting, which could include increasing products off the landscape, selective intensification of management, as well as longer rotations and reducing damage. And then number 5 is mutually exclusive from the others, establish forest reserves. Mutually exclusive because you're not going to be practicing silviculture intensive silviculture on forest preserves. Task D was identify a suite of financial incentives and technical assistance activities to increase carbon sequestration on these lands. And before we went too far into that, we spent some time that was very instructive to ask the question of who are these landowners? Who are what's the characteristics of the people we are targeting with this kind of a program that might be established in Maine? And to no one's surprise, 60% of these landowners are 65 years of age or older. Only 4% are 45 years of age or younger. And so there's obviously a clear boundary conditions to the demographics of who we're trying to approach with this kind of a program. Only 27% of these forests have a forest management plan. That's the bad news. The good news is that 90% of those who have a plan have implemented a component of it. And so that's encouraging that the more of these management plans and information that we make available to these landowners, that there's a good uptake on the utilization. But I hope that's not my phone. It is my phone. Excuse me. Potential spam, sorry. What are the landowner motivations for forest ownership? And from some research on small forest landowners, about half are woodland retreat owners by way of a category having to do with their primary interest is nature and recreation. Working landowners is 19%, same as the woodland retreat owners, only in addition importance of economic value of the land holding. Supplemental income owners, about 14%, primarily interested in timber income and investment. And then the last, uninvolved landowners, 19%, which in some cases is a concern because these lands are the most likely to be sold into development. So the task force recommended the following. To increase technical assistance that rapidly expands carbon-friendly management, and to increase financial incentives to implement carbon-enhancing forest practices, including long-term agreements to continue these practices over time. Some specifics within the draft report were significant investments in the Maine Forest Service, hire a forest carbon specialist at the senior planner level, increase district foresters by about 50%, enhance the Forest Service resources for marketing climate-friendly beneficial forest stewardship practices, meaning make the good information available even beyond that which district foresters can directly deliver. Increase alignment with NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service programs, a major source of financial support for some of these activities. And our CS has also contributed, agreed to contribute staff time to enhancing their forestry programs. And then double the investment in the WoodsWise program and hire a Maine Forest Service marketing and utilization forester to focus on developing improved markets for low-grade wood, which is so critical for the implementation of practices that capture that carbon for carbon-friendly utilization. In addition, there was a great deal of discussion about establishing a brand new program here in Maine and how we would go about that. Right now, there's a lot happening in the world of carbon, as many of you are well aware. And so the task force arrived at these recommendations, which was for the state to explore establishing with one or more external entities a voluntary credit-based or practice-oriented carbon program tailored to Maine's unique conditions if that at that point appeared warranted. The task force also went on to offer a number of specific recommendations as suggestions for consideration in those deliberations, but was not prescriptive as to the nature of this program. E, identify incentives for high-quality on-the-ground performance of loggers and promote the use of low-impact harvesting equipment. In this regard, some of the specific recommendations were that the Maine Forest Service carbon specialists would include loggers as part of their target stakeholders, promote voluntary use of third-party certification for logging contractors, expand cost-share opportunities for training and equipment, and increase reduced interest loans for equipment such as is available in direct link. F, recommend updates to the open space use taxation program. A number of subgroups of the task force sort of split out and dug deep in working through many of these recommendations. This was one of those. And then the entire task force took the information that was presented and recommended and deliberated. And so there's a number of recommendations for the open space program that include state reimbursement to municipalities, so the municipalities don't pay the cost of implementation of a program and loss of tax revenue. Revise the valuation in the open space program, streamline and simplify the program, and allow transfer from tree growth to open space without penalty as these modifications might be implemented. G, explore opportunities for partnerships with large commercial forest landowners. The task force was pretty specific in our deliberations to focus on the 10 to 10,000 acre and not to drift sort of mission creep beyond that, and the recommendations are focused on that. This task asked the task force to consider it. There's an ongoing discussion that forest carbon for commercial landowners that's convened by the Maine Climate Table. That's been ongoing, and basically the task force encourages that dialogue to continue, not exclusive to other dialogues about sort of statewide opportunities that might be developed. H, consider opportunities for Maine to participate in multi-state carbon initiatives, and the task force co-chairs who were just here have been in discussions with the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation and the Future, the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is very involved in developing regional programs and dialogues, as well as the states of Massachusetts, Vermont, and New York, about the possibilities of developing regional programs, or at least regional frameworks that would shape the nature of the programs that develop in these states to allow more commonality where it makes sense. And then finally, the last task was what sounds like one that would be pretty straightforward and logical, and it is not. And that's to recommend a numeric goal or target for increased carbon sequestration in Maine over time. So the task force was being asked to come up with a number, how much carbon, and by when. And this is pretty challenging for a lot of reasons. Some of it are the data that are available. Some of it's the primary research that needs to be done to support truly identifying that kind of a quantitative target. In order to get a sense of where we are at, I thought it might be useful, bear with me, and I hope you can see the lines, at least from the back of the room. This is a plot, right now, this is a plot of Maine's gross greenhouse gas emissions. You already saw this. It was kind of squashed to the left of the graph earlier on, but this is the last 30 years of Maine's greenhouse gas emissions, with the peak in the 2000s and the decline that we referred to. And it's this that we're trying to offset. It's this that we want to eliminate, right? If we look at what happens in our forest, you probably can't see it because these are at the bottom. But at the bottom here, there's a curve that's crossing that time period, and it's continuing to go more negative. In this case, this represents the amount of carbon in our forests that's accumulating over time on an annual basis, because that's offsetting the carbon that's going into the atmosphere. So, you know, if 8 units go into the atmosphere, but we store 5 units on the stump, new additional units on the stump, that means there's only really 5 new units of that gas that ends up in the atmosphere. That's what this is trying to represent. So the line at the bottom, what you can see is numbers aren't really that important, but it was almost near 0, and now it's more like -10. This is carbon in forests expressed as greenhouse gas, CO2 equivalents. And so we have dramatically increased on an annual basis the amount of sequestration taking place in our forests. We're at a high over time in the annual accumulation of carbon on the stump. You add to that, this group of course knows far more than me about that line, that's the products. And so if we count the amount of carbon that's going into products, that carbon is, particularly the durable products, is also stored over time. If we add the two together, the thick line there then is the sum of carbon in the ecosystem and carbon products that have, on an annual basis, been retaining carbon that therefore is not counted as new carbon in the atmosphere. And if we take that green line at the bottom and subtract it from the greenhouse gases up in the sky, then the dark blue line now is the net. And so that's what's left over that's been going into the atmosphere as a result of all the carbon that we're storing in forests and forest products. Last line I'll show you is that, which is the black dotted line is the running time series of carbon offsets in our forests in Maine as a result of accumulating carbon on the stump and products. And over the last 10 years, that averages about, as you heard the governor mention, I think, about 65%. So Maine's forests are already offsetting about 65% of our gross greenhouse gas emissions. Our goal, of course, is to get that dark blue line down to 0. And at that point, we will be at carbon neutral. Okay? The reason I drag you through all of that is because the task force recommendations for a specific target were as follows, and the first one's the important one, a statewide total forest carbon sector sequestration of no less than 12 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year through 2045, which basically is if we can maintain our current relatively high level of sequestration, we'll be doing really well. And therefore, coming up with some much larger, much higher target that would be very difficult to achieve and have lots of other consequences that we don't want would be problematic. So the target actually is to stay where we're at. We want to stay where we're at because it's relatively high, at least in the current draft report. The other recommendations, the bullets here are just highlighting that that's both forest ecosystem carbon, so all the components of the forest, as well as forest products. And so we can store, and we've been talking about, and you all are deeply engaged in moving Maine forward on a range of innovative products. And of course, I work at a university where there's a lot of excitement about what we're doing in a number of different arenas. We should measure this on a 5-year rolling average because any one year has ups and downs. And we should reevaluate this target every 5 years because at a minimum, the science we have and the data we have will improve, but we'll also advance in our science. So last example before I quit. If we took, and this is bringing some of the economics into it, Logan Woodyard there that's in the front row, because she's a good student, she's in the front row. Worked with Adam Dagenau, who's the whiz kid at the university, and I know many of you know, that has been leading some of our various groups on carbon and the economics of carbon, and Logan's been working with Adam and a group of us, and she was an intern for the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future this summer. So here's a calculation where we say, okay, let's make the assumption that these small woodland owners participate in what's being recommended, and for the sake of, what's the max, the exercise was calculated, if we have 100% participation, all forest conversion is avoided. All the landowners participate in some of the forest management and arbitrarily divided 30% in each of those three categories of management. And 10% of the landowners establish forest reserves. How much carbon would we get and what would it cost today? And that back of the envelope calculation is we get 4 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year. And the annual cost would be $54 million, or about $13.50 per ton metric ton of CO2 equivalent, which in the world of carbon offsets and costs is pretty cheap as we look across the landscape of other kinds of natural climate solutions. So in closing, the task force recognizes that there's a balance between achieving the goal of maintaining or increasing timber harvests to grow Maine's forest economy and to engage in active forest management, as well as accumulating carbon on the stump. And in addition, we need to be mindful of what we talk about as carbon leakage, meaning we save it here, but then someone else does more in another state or another country. We will have solved nothing for the climate crisis at that point. The task force also recognizes that the state's forests are vulnerable to a lot of different stressors, and more so going forward: pests, disease, climate extremes, wildfire, and certainly development, that all impact our ability to sequester carbon. So I personally was excited about the discussions that we had, because I think it's a unique time that we're living through for a lot of ways. Some of it's scary, but some of it is a critical opportunity to invest in our forests and to have a major and important contribution to the climate challenge that we face at the same time. So with that, thank you.
Sure. There we go.
Yes, sir. Education program in one out of every 11 acres is focused on education, also on feeding local spots, which is not the best thing for sequestration. Some of the ones that of course, governor, there is keep on and there's keep on that end, Brandon, these areas were on annual basis, much higher than just big for us, and have to really go down all that time once the campus closed. So what we're using local nights that needs to be it also has and that is using the product we have the characters and additionally increase the annual sequestration on all.
Yeah, so Pat probably remembers some of the number of these discussions that in the subgroups that I was not part of. I can't obviously speak to. Yes, that was discussed as far as an important aspect of the kind of technical expertise that we want to provide and get out there. I wasn't part of any specific discussions about an educational program for that particular concern. It was discussed in the nature of the kinds of technical assistance that needed to be provided, the capacity of the Forest Service district foresters to reach how many foresters in that regard. I would say it clearly was included in the intent of what providing technical information would be about. It wouldn't just be, that was the poor and moderate calculation was for a perspective. It wasn't the sole focus of the discussions about which landowners were a high priority. And the overstock were a part of those discussions. But I don't know whether Pat remembers a specific educational, but no.
I don't.
mentioned, smaller and large contractors. I have two questions. The first one, if we achieve carbon neutrality by 2045, how do we maintain that neutrality? I'll give you an example. I always joke everybody that I'm not a company because I don't, my footprint is less than two and always sequestration. People counting on it, so we do have studies on it.
Welcome to my world.
How does that balance go? Because in the state, we want to bring in industry that will have a increase our carbon footprint, and maybe we'll lose forest cover for development to have that. So, who's back with monitoring neutrality? After that answer, I can understand.
Okay. Todd will do the second one. No. Good question. I mean, a number of good points in that. The Maine Department of Environmental Protection is tasked with coming out with a biennial report on Maine's greenhouse gas emissions. And so every 2 years they do that. That's where those plots come from. So from the standpoint of, and you know, my day job is as a soil scientist and as a biogeochemist, and so I did some of the work on the carbon budget for the state of Maine, everything from wetlands and dissolved carbon in water to our forests. So that's complex. Ultimately, what matters is what the atmosphere sees on an annual basis. And so whatever the metaphor is, the truth of the matter will be, can we document that we are decreasing carbon emissions to the atmosphere? We can do a lot of different things below that in order to achieve that. First and foremost is stop burning fossil fuels. That curve is a function of mostly burning fossil fuels in the state of Maine. And then Maine's forests are contributing to that. The more we can store in our forests and our forest products, the more we contribute to bringing that curve down. Also, if we rapidly electrify our transportation system and our home heating, et cetera, that curve's going to come down by itself. And obviously, we're doing a lot to do that. So it's going to, unless we start to reverse course, it's almost inevitable we're going to get to carbon neutral. The question here is, can the forests still be vibrant and drive our economy and contribute a little bit to that carbon goal? Great. I say the same thing in agriculture. It's like, this is a wonderful time to invest in agriculture and soil health and et cetera. And oh, by the way, we'll make these systems more resilient, and we may store a little bit of extra carbon. And so I view it as there's a lot of good things going on that we want to do. We want to drive industry. We want to develop these products. We want to invest in our forest health, et cetera, for all of the benefits that we get from it. And we're going to track how well we're doing as a state. You know, I use this metaphor. If I'm a little sensor hanging out of the sky, what do I see year after year? And so if we end up doing things that develop more industry that don't achieve as much on the forest carbon side, but we then take up that loss by what we do on fossil fuels, you know, we get to the same place. So it's a tough question. Yeah, we want to sort of maintain our forest. We certainly want to keep as much forest as forests, but for the most part, they're working forests, and we want to keep them as working forests. We don't want to go backwards. We want to protect them from disturbance. You don't want to be the western forests that are blowing off carbon with mega fires. That's a problem. So I'm not saying that we're bound for that. We have more forests lately, but we're not bound for that. So that's kind of I'm circling the barn there, but that's the way I answer it. Ultimately, it's what the atmosphere sees. Now you have a second question.
Point B, the only use of high quality water. I know Dave is a man with
Yes.
20 years ago, I had to not a lot of those there. So that type issue that we laws talked about where we want to use the quality of water.
Yep.
And they were excluded from the science before. And I guess that's a lot of people. That's what the whole program is about. The people are so people. We felt maybe something.
Yep. That's great.
I don't know
So what's the question?
Straight answer question being why weren't they included in the draft report as a program that could help people?
This draft report,
Yeah.
besides Dana being on the task force?
Draft slide, which is you saw, I look at it, I think the language is where we get there. So that, the landowner to recognize the quality, that's a lot of the way to help.
Oh, I don't know the answer to that question. Do you?
No, only that it wasn't about excluding master logger, it was about including other programs too. So that was if you pick one over the other, or if you name one in particular, then it becomes problematic. But you can see the language was put in there that recognized in general those kinds of things are really important for the logging community. Yeah. Logging certification, right? Oh, okay. Yeah.
Two, yeah.
I think there's master logger in there in a section though as well. But that was the debate that was going on. Do we single out one program and make it exclusive, or do we make sure we're keeping it wide open for people? Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I agree. Well, and there's a comment period that's been out there. They're going to get all these comments back, and we'll see where yeah, good. And the other part about coming up with a number and balancing out carbon, I guess I was a fly in the ointment about picking a number, because I was uncomfortable with where we know we want the industry to go. We don't know enough about what we're particularly measuring. And Ivan was a supporter of saying we've got to find language that gets us, having a goal, but there's all sorts of qualifiers around that language. To me, it's probably doable to grow the industry and increase carbon stores, at least for the next 20 years. After that, I can't make any guarantee, because that spruce budworm, spruce fir resource is growing, but I think it's going to, mature again. So that's why it was a compromise to say, let's set a reasonable goal at where we're at and measure it and see where it goes, but understand it may change because the industry needs more wood. So it is that balancing act.
No, we don't. We didn't have a graph that actually showed. We did talk about what people knew were the characters of, the characteristics of, there's probably characters too, but the characteristics of, the larger landowners versus the smaller landowners. Some landowners own multiple, multiple parcels, and so they fall into different categories. So no, we did not have sort of descriptive, and that was one we talked about it. I don't remember. Logan, did you remember any? Yeah. We didn't have any nice chart of descriptive statistics on the different sizes of land ownership and who was actually owning them. That we wanted. We talked about it. We talked about it qualitatively, but we didn't have those data. They couldn't come up with those data. Absolutely. Yep. Right. I completely agree. And for those that can't, his question is about, there were big error bars, or there was a wide range relative to the quantification of the amount of land or the amount of whatever that was in this cohort. And, isn't that challenging to develop policy? It absolutely is. And that is a high priority. It's a high priority in the research world. Particularly, I talk a lot about, so if we implement policies, how are we going to track it going forward? How are we going to know we were successful, to validate what we're claiming that we're doing? We need to be able to measure it. And so there's a lot of activity using remote sensing. I got colleagues that are using sensors on the International Space Station to measure for it, and we can do some pretty amazing things. But the bottom line right now is we don't have in place an ongoing monitoring database that can close that gap. And part of it is there's a number of other, or a few other efforts at inventory, and because of different methodologies, what have you, they vary a lot. And so that added to the sort of ranges that we came up with. But I don't have an answer to, oh yeah, but we know how to do it better than that. I don't think we do right now know how to quantify with the kind of precision we need to implement the programs that I think the public would like to see, and be able to measure it accurately. We need to develop programs mindful of what we can do, and then obviously work on getting better and better at it. And we're right on the frontier with remote sensing and LiDAR and new sensors. More investment on the ground. The challenge is it's really expensive to actually, I'm an old guy, I'm an empirical scientist, so it's really expensive to send people like me out into the woods and measure trees and dig holes and measure coarse woody debris. That validates all of these kind of other sensors. And so it's not a quick process, but we've made tremendous advances and we will get better, but you're right, that's a problem. Peter. Taken into account in what way? Yeah, right. No, I don't think we explicitly had a modeled output. We do in some of the natural climate solutions work that Adam Dagnall leads, and et cetera. But there's a number of different stressors, including budworm, that could have a big impact on, and that's why at the very end, at the end of the report and at the end of these slides, it says we need to be mindful going forward. On one hand, these forests are subject to all sorts of stressors, and almost all of them put back that carbon back into the atmosphere, and we've got to recover. On the other hand, if we're wildly successful and those kind of disturbances over the next 30 years don't occur, wildly successful in trying to enhance carbon storage on the landscape and in products, storing it on the landscape won't go on forever. And so we'll get to a point where we'll be at this maximum capacity, and at that point, we're not going to be able to store it more, and if we go backwards, it goes back to the atmosphere. And so it's a significant challenge, and that's why I think the task force was comfortable, for some of the reasons Pat talked about and I mentioned, to say, well, let's take where we're at now, because we seem to be at a high now and we understand what it is, and try and at least protect that going forward, because it's already doing 60–70% of the offsetting in Maine. Good key point. Back to you.
Now you can see Ivan, thank you so much. He's been hearing me whine a lot during these carbon meetings, and he's been a voice of reason, so I really appreciate his involvement.